And then how can those who want change work on nonviolent ways to maybe pull some of those pillars away? And if you do enough of that, then eventually the building falls down, right? So the key thought in this tool, and also, approaching nonviolently, is rulers rely on people to provide various services for the functioning of society. If people withdraw their support and stop providing those services, the ruler can't rule any longer. So it's trying to figure out what organizations or what institutions are supporting the power structure, and then to find ways to influence people in those various pillars of support so their loyalty to that oppressive ruler starts to erode, and they start to withdraw their support, and they stop serving him or the group of leaders. But in this, thinking about this, it does need to be done in nonviolent means, through conversations, through, various ways of trying to influence, because once we add violence toward any of these pillars, then they tend to be more defensive and they get harder. So it is trying to think of nonviolent ways to weaken the loyalty, if you will, or to help them, people underneath, the servants of the regime, if you will, the low people, but still important. There's lots of people that holds up an oppressive regime. And if there's ways to shift their attitudes and start to make them less loyal, then the whole thing starts to get a little bit shakier. Now, again, I don't know the situation in Burma enough to be able to be specific, but this is a tool that has worked in numbers of places to help analyze, think through, why can it keep so much power, and what would be the easiest way to start, what aspect of life would be one way to start working on through nonviolent kinds of approaches. So that's one tool. The other tool to just think about, and we could spend a whole session on this, and this is called a social barometer. And the key thought here is that societies include people with a wide range of perspectives on the issue that's being worked on. So you have the active allies, the ones working for change, that you're agreeing with, I'm assuming at this point. Then you have people who are kind of passive allies, and you have neutral people, passive opponents and active opponents. And with this tool of analysis, you identify who your allies and opponents are and where people are in the spectrum, and then figure out how to shift people one movement. So people who are kind of neutral, how can you just shift the neutral people to be kind of passive allies? Or how can you shift passive allies to be more active? So it's just working to shift people over a little bit, which is hopeful because you're not thinking you're going to change the active opponents. But if you have enough people that are moving this direction, then again, holding up the power is more difficult. And actually, the book of Esther is a very interesting example of how she saved her people from genocide, basically, through this kind of a approach. She didn't know she was doing that, but she shows that approach in what happens there. So just two tools. There's a lot of tools, but I want those kind of can be interesting. And then you also have the handout of methods of nonviolent action I wanted to follow up from the last session, because there's just a ton of different things. Some of them out in the open protest type things, some of them hiding away because it's too dangerous, and doing other things that are still showing disapproval, some of them non-cooperation, so things can't happen in the country, and doing enough so that there's enough reason for the oppressive power and control to be starting to willing to think about needing to do something differently than what's happening. So, and I'm not going to continue on with that, but those are just, there's a lot of tools in this area if it's going to be something that would be helpful to you. So what we are going to talk about today, or this last session, is transforming and healing trauma. And if we could have the PowerPoint number 4. And did you get that handout with, oh, this one. Let's do this handout. This is actually, thank you. Do each one, yeah, all 3 of them. I don't have a big long PowerPoint for this. I just have these three things, so you'll have exactly what's up there. So when violence happens in a conflict situation, as I'm sure you're aware of, trauma also happens, and it has a really great negative effect. And one consequence of experiencing this trauma through violence is that a person often wants revenge, and so goes on to inflict injury and death and trauma on others. And so we get these cycles of trauma and injury. And so the cycle of violence then has a way of feeding itself. So the cycle goes on and on and on. And what's needed is a way to transform and heal the trauma, at least enough so that the cycles of violence are broken and the possibility of coexistence and reconciliation is possible. So I think as pastors and religious leaders, it would be helpful for a short time, or this last session, to think about this, because trauma leading to more violence, I think, happens a great deal. And again, you can see this so much in the Israel-Hamas situation. The Hamas doing the terrorism attack and the butchering of people, practically huge trauma. And then the revenge going back onto the Palestinian people, trying to get Hamas, more trauma. And if we look at that, 100% of the people probably traumatized. It's a feeding ground for more terrorism. So there'll be more violence and trauma. So it just goes on and on and on. And I'm assuming some of that is happening in your country as well. And pastors and religious leaders, if you understand, can be maybe helping the healing so that those cycles can be broken. So we are going to do this by looking at 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. 2 Samuel verses 21, verses 1 through 14. It's a story of Rizpah. And I have to give credit to Dan and Sharon Buttry for these thoughts, because I learned about this from them, the way that I am organizing this session. They've written a book regarding it called Daughters of Rizpah, Nonviolence and the Transformation of Trauma. So there's more information there. But they are the one, in their training, their 10-day training for conflict transformation trainers have been teaching people this model. So let's read together 2 Samuel, and then we'll look at these 3 cycles. 2 Samuel, chapter 21, verses 1 through 14. Samuel 21, 1 through 14. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord. The Lord said, "There is blood guilt on Saul and on his house, because he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had tried to wipe them out in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. David said to the Gibeonites, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make expiation? What, that you may bless the heritage of the Lord. The Gibeonites said to him, it is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put anyone to death in Israel. He said, so what do you say that I should do for you, to make things right? They said to the king, the man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we would have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be handed over to us, and we will impale them, execute them, before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord. The king said, I will hand them over, the sons of Saul. But the king spared Mephibosheth. I should practice that. Let's see. Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan, because of the oath of the Lord that was between them, between David and Jonathan, son of Saul. The king took 2 sons of Rizpah, daughter of Ai, whom she had borne to Saul. So Saul's 2 sons through Rizpah, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and the 5 sons of Merab, daughter of Saul, so grandsons of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Meholathite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they impaled them on the mountain before the Lord. 7 of them perished together, and they were put to death in the first days of the harvest at the beginning of the barley harvest. It's a terrible story. Then Rizpah, mother of 2 of them, the daughter of Ai, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock for herself from the beginning of the harvest until rain fell on them from the heavens. She did not allow the birds of the air to come on the bodies by day or the wild animals by night. When David heard what Rizpah, daughter of Ai, the concubine of Saul, had done, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan from the people of Jabesh Gilead, who had stolen them from the public square of Bethshan, where the Philistines had hung them on the day that the Philistines killed Saul on Gibeah. He brought up from there the bones of Saul and the bones of his son Jonathan, and they gathered the bones of those who had been impaled, the 2 sons, 5 grandsons. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan in the land of Benjamin, in Zelah, in the tomb of his father Kish. They did all that the king commanded. And after that, God heeded supplications for the land. So this is a very horrible kind of story of what happened back in the time of King David. So to kind of summarize it once again, there was a famine in Israel, and David prays to God regarding it, trying to figure out why is this happening and what does he need to do to get relief from it. And he gets this understanding from God that it's related to the previous King Saul having shed innocent blood by massacring the Gibeonites. Gibeonites are an ethnic community within Israel. They had kind of done some sneaky dealing in order to get this promise not to be killed, because Israel was killing a lot when they came into the land. But anyway, there was a treaty, there was an oath that they wouldn't be hurt, and yet King Saul massacred a whole bunch of them. So David meets with the Gibeonites, and as we heard, asks how he's making things right. They don't want financial compensation. Instead, they want these 7 male descendants of Saul to be executed. David agrees, hands them over, and they are killed publicly in a religious ritual before the Lord, it says. Well, we don't read any more about Merab, the one mother. We read about Rizpah, who takes sackcloth, a sign of mourning, right, and begins vigil by the bodies, driving away the scavenging birds and wild animals and refusing to let the bodies be dishonored. So she does this for several months, from the time of the barley harvest in October, generally, until the spring rains in May. Can you imagine a mother sitting by the bodies of her sons and relatives for all of those days, shooing away the animals and the birds? So there is no, eventually David hears about this, what Rizpah is doing. And actually, this was probably a little bit of a civil disobedient act on Rizpah's part, because the dishonoring the bodies was probably intended to be part of the execution in the punishment or the revenge on them. But eventually David hears about what Rizpah is doing. And after collecting the bones of King Saul and Jonathan, he comes to Rizpah and collects the bones of her sons and Merib's sons and buries them in an honorable fashion in the ancestral burial grounds. So there's no written details here about that encounter between King David and Rizpah, but it seems likely that David was trying to make things right with her, and that they went together to give the bones of her family a proper burial in the ancestral land. So that's kind of the story, and it illustrates these cycles of victim, of aggressor, and of healing and trauma. So let's look at how this story does that. First of all, we'll talk about the victim-survivor cycle, and you have that one, the victim-survivor cycle. Merib, the mother of the 5 that were executed, is a classic victim of the violence. She wasn't killed herself, but can you imagine the trauma of seeing her children killed like this? The victim cycle begins with a trauma-inducing event, some kind of aggression, and of course it's very, very threatening. Any kind of trauma just it has a lot of physiological shock kinds of responses in the body, as well as terrible feelings of shock and denial and anger, shame, fear, all sorts of feelings that she would have experienced. She probably was asking, why me? Why is this happening? All of those questions. The denial may have been experienced, a feeling like she was in a bad dream and she would wake up and it would be okay. That's often what people experience. Or sometimes people numb out these intense feelings and dissociate emotionally, and it's difficult to be present in the moment. And others may turn to alcohol or drugs to kind of numb the feelings that they have after a trauma, so they don't feel that pain. So intense feelings also of anger and panic, and the urge often rises up to strike back and to destroy. So the anger can be turned toward God, or the anger can be turned, of course, toward the aggressor, but the anger can also be turned toward oneself and cause depression in a victim. All of these powerful feelings can be overwhelming and then be suppressed in an attempt to gain some sense of control and overcome the sense of helplessness in the midst of this situation. And then suppression of feelings can lead to feelings of shame and humiliation. For example, Merib may have felt like as a mother she should have been able to keep her children safe. These may have been pretty young men. And yet she had failed to do so. And so this sense of humiliation may make people want to isolate themselves. And she just disappears from the story, actually. We don't hear about her again. Some people from this victim-survivor cycle, it's pretty frequent that people feel a desire for justice and for revenge. And they may have fantasies of revenge, of getting back at the aggressor. And so that moves us into the second cycle. Some of them just stay lost as a victim, and then many may move on to becoming an aggressor out of their experience of having been a victim. So the aggressor-offender cycle describes this next process of moving through various stages from a sense of identity as a victim of trauma to justification of continuing acts of aggression. And so we see the Gibeonites, the ethnic minority under Israelite rule, as illustrating this cycle. When King Saul broke this treaty that Israel had with them and basically committed genocide in massacring the Gibeonites, there was tremendous personal and social trauma that occurred. And when that happened, they went through probably the victim survival cycle and had some shame and humiliation, but then they move on. Especially when David comes to them and asks them what to do, they get a way to move forward on their desire for revenge. So the Gibeonites saw Saul as an evil king and saw themselves as innocent victims. And so very often what happens in this situation is there's the development of a good versus evil narrative. The other person is totally evil and we're good. Okay, it starts out and then it moves on to dehumanization of the enemy. By labeling the other person as evil, the victim can get back some sense of their humanity or their dignity that they feel that they were robbed of. And from there, it's easy to dehumanize the other one. And dehumanizing the enemy is a step toward justifying violence toward them. If the enemy is hopelessly evil, then the enemy must be punished and destroyed. And dehumanizing words may include calling people animals or vermin or cockroaches or scum or garbage. All these things are subhuman. And we saw that so much in the Israel-Hamas conflict. The massacre occurred by Hamas, and like in a day, the Hamas was being called, and they kind of generalized it to the Palestinians, were being called subhuman animals. This dehumanization starts to rationalize the violence that will follow. And we see that in a lot of genocides, that kind of activity. At this point is where the Gibeonites were when David came to try to make things right, and they didn't want financial compensation. They wanted revenge. They wanted blood. They wanted to kill the male descendants of Saul. And social pressure would add to that because of the dishonor that they had experienced and the desire to act on that. And then David gives them that opportunity to do so. So this resulted then in a new act of aggression, right? Committed in the name of restoring honor or justice. So now these people who had been victims, their people had genocide against them, many people killed. Now they are the ones that are killing these 7 young, maybe teenage boys as a way to get justice, but now they're causing trauma to other kinds of people. So what to do? This can go on and on, right? This can go on and on. The victim, aggressor, the violence can just continue on. So how can we get out of this cycle? So Rizpah, and you've got this handouts because it is hard to see this up there. Rizpah, her story and her actions illustrate how to break out of these cycles by illustrating the trauma healing journey. So Rizpah was definitely the victim of trauma. She didn't stay stuck in that victim role, but neither did she pursue violent revenge. So we don't see her slinking off and just feeling bad and disappearing in the story like Merab. And we don't see her doing anything violent, getting revenge. Instead, we see that she chose to grieve in public and to take up a vigil of keeping the wild animals and birds away from the bodies of her sons. So she was making sure her sons were remembered. She was not willing to have them be killed and then all covered over and life goes on. No, she kept right there day after day after day so that she was keeping them in the public eye in a way, this injustice that had been done. And she did so at risk. She could have been hauled away because quite possibly the dishonoring was part of the punishment. Mourning and memorializing are some of the first acts of breaking free and choosing to live after the trauma of violence. The next stage says accept loss, name and confront fears. Okay, so this is accepting the reality of the loss. It's not accepting the injustice. It's accepting that it happened. And if she had fears of what they might do to her as she kept on bringing this to the public awareness, as they saw her day after day, she still refused to hide or to disappear, to let the injustices not be addressed. Next comes the question, why them? This involves trying to understand the reasons and the root causes for the aggressors doing this violence. So it's trying to think, why would they do that? Why would they do that? That they would do this terrible action of killing young men. What this does in trying to understand is it is rehumanizing, in a sense, the aggressor. It's rehumanizing them because it's trying to kind of get into their thoughts or trying to understand what they're doing. So the aggressors are not just subhuman, evil ones. They're people who perpetuated this trauma because of something else, because of their own fears or needs or experience of injustice or past traumas. So victims may, even in that process, realize the shortcomings of their own group and how they may have contributed to that. And Rizpah was someone who lived a little bit on the margins. She was a concubine. And so she maybe could have a better sense of being able to think into what it was like for another kind of marginalized group, the Gibeonites. So, thinking again, I'm going to let you contextualize it into Burma, but thinking again about the Israelite-Hamas situation, wasn't the trauma that happened of Hamas doing this terrible terrorism act and Israel responding in the over-extreme way that it does. If you look back not too far, lots of trauma, right? Lots of trauma. The establishment of Israel back in 1948 was because of the Holocaust, to have their own land so they would be protected, Jewish people, and not experience that kind of trauma again. And what happened in the process? The Palestinians were taken off their land. Their land was just taken and given to form the country of Israel, the great catastrophe. And so they were living in the Gaza Strip and some in West Bank. They're refugees. They're refugees for 70 years. And all of this time kind of living on that trauma. And the only way they could figure out in their minds of what they could do after trying the many, many things is to bring the situation up for public view by the terrible violence that Hamas did. So if you look there, you see trauma has produced trauma has produced trauma. There's reasons, and part of rehumanizing the enemy or the aggressor, the trauma-inducing person, is to understand a little bit about why they ended up in that situation, that they would do this terrible thing. It keeps them human and keeps us from saying they're not human. So Rizpah was willing to take risks. It was a commitment to take some risks. She probably knew that, she was kind of publicly defying the king's order, but she takes that risk because she doesn't think there's much to lose. So the next step in this trauma healing situation is tolerance, coexistence, and interconnectedness, according to this cycle. Sometimes it is the victim who initiates contact with the aggressor and goes directly to the offender. But in this case, King David comes to Rizpah. He heard about what was going on, and apparently he must have wanted to make something right with her. So he comes to her, and instead of rejecting him, we don't hear a lot about this, but so we're kind of thinking through kind of making the story a little bit bigger and from the little details we have. But instead of rejecting him, she apparently accepts his gesture of goodwill. And it seems like the offender and the victim, the mother of those executed, are now joined in the project of putting things to be as right as they can be at this point, by giving them the best possible burial, taking the bones to the ancestral site. So we don't know what words they said between them. There probably were some words. But all restorative justice does require this encounter between victim and offender in some form. Then we move on. It says choosing to forgive. We don't know how fully Rizpah forgave at this point, but she seems to have at least probably put her grief aside enough to go along and have her sons be buried. And by coming to Rizpah and burying these bones, David was essentially admitting guilt and trying to make restitution to Rizpah. So this is the coming into the presence of the mother whose children he allowed to be killed. It can be seen almost as an act of repentance on the part of David. Forgiveness is a complicated matter in offense and trauma, a very complicated matter. Dan Buttrey speaks of forgiveness as being willing to bear the pain and hurt another has caused because one values the relationship. So this may involve setting the pain aside enough to have the emotional space that allows the relationship to heal. Then, as we move along here, there is the telling of a new story, a more complicated story than just good and evil. And we see that in this story in 2 Samuel. This is the story that includes a number of the nuances, the complicated aspects to it. So reconciliation finally, as the final way that we're trying to get to in order to stop these cycles, it's really possible only after a long journey with many intentional steps along the way to healing and justice. And it takes a lot of personal courage. Trauma is very hard to deal with. Some reconciliation seems to have occurred here between King David and Rizpah. And it might have been the start of a deeper reconciliation between the house of David, who is the tribe of Judah, and the house of Saul, which was the tribe of Benjamin. Many years later, when David's grandson was ruling, there was a civil war among all the tribes of Israel. And there's only one other tribe that stayed with Judah, with the house of David, and that was Benjamin, the house of Saul, the people from which Rizpah had been a part of, and her sons and those other grandsons. This is the only clue we have about why those tribes somehow got reconciled, the house of David and the house of Saul. But the story of a traumatized woman who raises her voice in nonviolent protest at grave, unjust violence transforms the situation, leading to a small measure of justice and healing for her, and opens up this opportunity for future reconciliation between these two groups of people. So I bring this to you because I think it's helpful for us as pastors and faith leaders to understand the relationship between being victimized and experiencing trauma and then becoming violent aggressors, and to understand these cycles and what's required to move away from the violence and toward healing. Because trauma itself is just very hard to experience within one's body, within one's soul, within one's mind, within one's emotions. It's such a hard thing, as quite probably many of you understand. So I think I would be interested to hear your thoughts about how you have tried, or how you would think about going about to help those who've experienced trauma and violence to move toward healing. But I think from from these cycles, we have some clues about what might be helpful and supportive. We can understand the desire for revenge. That's a really natural and normal response, and yet strongly encourage against it. It only keeps the cycle of violence going. I know in some of the inner city areas where there's some like gang violence and young men shoot another man, the first thing is, then the family or the friends of that man want to go back and shoot this one. And sometimes there have been violence interrupters in some of our cities that go and, as quickly as they hear about something, they go to the community of the victim and work with them and try to persuade them not to take revenge, which would be another violence, and just keep it going. So that's one thing, is try to help people realize taking revenge it's not going to make them feel better. It's not going to be helpful in the long run. It just keeps it going. We can encourage and provide opportunities for public grieving and for nonviolent protest of the injustice. So it helps to be able to grieve, not just push it all down, to have public grieving and remembering of victims. We can steer people away from dehumanizing the aggressor and instead seek to bring understanding together about the deeper reasons for their violence, to the extent that we know. And that's part of what, if it's ever possible to hear the story, it's the Peace and Reconciliation. Some of those commissions have done that to try to understand each other better, but just not dehumanize as totally evil and subhuman someone who's done a terrible act, but to try to understand instead what was behind that. And we can support what is needed to bring healing, and perhaps out of that, and I should say support, often, there's a lot of counseling, and there's a lot of support services in this country that are trauma-informed and helpful for people that are having trauma responses, reliving memories, all that kind of stuff. So this country especially, there is a lot of resources available. So we can support people seeking out that help. And perhaps even at some point there can be a measure of reconciliation between the aggressors. Now, I'm not necessarily applying it directly this minute to the military situation. I'm going to have you talk about that. But like in our cities where there have been gangs of young men fighting against each other, by working in helping deal with the trauma and keeping the revenge from going, and supporting the healing and trying to do that, then communities sometimes can bring reconciliation into the community. In South Africa, the terrible apartheid and violence and all of that, they had truth and reconciliation commissions where people were able to tell their story of the terrible trauma that they experienced and have it heard, and express what they needed. And sometimes they just needed some small thing from the perpetrator in order to move forward in their journey of healing. So that is actually what I have to share about that, and I think we're right on time for discussion. So I'm happy to talk about this more in terms of responding to questions, but I'm also, this is the last thing. Oh, before I give over the podium here, 1 second. Let me say my final paragraph here. And that is, so this is the end of what I'm going to be sharing with you. So let me summarize what a few things. Because when I talked with Henry about doing this, it was, I think, how can pastor and church leaders be peacemakers and peace builders was kind of the question we're dealing with. And so let me just say a few sentences of what we've done together. I think you can preach the gospel of peace. Preaching about actions that lead to the peace that we hope will be embraced by the world. God's vision for a peaceful and just society. So the gospel of peace, we talked about that last night. You can teach the ways of Jesus. We've talked about that together. We've talked about his transforming initiatives, his words about what to do when two people are in conflict, with each other, go direct, talk about it, work it out, bring the other mediator if you need to. We can teach Jesus' way of peace on how to be nonviolent and how to deal with conflict. We can be the mediators, potentially, or the negotiators. If we are viewed, pastors are that in many situations, I think. They have the relationships, the connections, and perhaps the not being part of the conflict, that they can be mediators in the way that we looked also at. Can be peace builders. We talked about a triangle here, the trainings, the doing the things that will help a country and people within the country know how to move toward peace and toward ways of dealing with problems in a peaceful manner. And right now I'm saying you can be helpful in healing the trauma by understanding, by listening, by giving opportunity for public sorrow and expression, by helping people not take revenge and perpetuate more trauma and violence on others, and by supporting them into a journey of healing. And then finally, I think you can be leaders that move toward a vision of a peaceful society. So we need moral imagination, right? The imagination to see what could be a peaceful society. And then if we keep that vision in mind, then what are the steps we need to take to get there and move on those little by little. So that's my final little words, and you're free to talk about this particular subject, or there's, whatever else you want to lead this discussion in.
Thank you so much. Dong nak le kam phan chang na ji pathum le minute pangat yang discussion to ako salai le